The Watcher in the Coffin. The town of Oakwood had always been a quiet place. Its cobblestone streets, colonial-style houses, and lush green parks provided a calm, almost idyllic setting. But that serenity was shattered when the mysterious death of wealthy businessman Richard Hawthorne sent shockwaves through the town. Richard was not just any ordinary citizen. He was a man of immense influence, his wealth accumulated from decades of shady but highly successful business dealings. He had no family to speak of, no children, no siblings, and his closest relationships seemed to be with the enigmatic figures who ran in the circles of Oakwood's elite. And yet, in his will, he left behind a strange, unsettling request. A CCTV camera was to be installed on his coffin during the funeral, and the footage was to be monitored live by a select few individuals, each of whom had been specifically invited. The town buzzed with confusion and unease as the details of the will were revealed. Why did Richard want such an odd thing? The footage wasn't even to be shared with the public, just a handful of people, all of whom were somehow linked to Richard's past. Among them was Detective Lena, a woman who had been invited due to her involvement in solving a series of cold cases related to Richard's business dealings. Lena had heard of Richard Hawthorne for years. He was a man known for being elusive, cunning, and, as some said, downright dangerous. People spoke of him in hushed tones, often linking his name to unsolved crimes and mysterious disappearances. But Lena had never interacted with him directly, not until she received the invitation. Curiosity gnawed at her as the day of the funeral approached. She couldn't help but wonder why Richard had chosen her to witness this strange final act. Perhaps it was because of her work on his cases, or perhaps it was something darker, something that only she could uncover. The funeral was held at the Hawthorne estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Oakwood. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Inside the grand hall, the mourners gathered in silence. The guest list was small but notable: business associates, former colleagues, and a few family friends who had kept their distance for years. But they had all come to witness the final spectacle. At the front of the room, Richard's coffin rested on a gilded platform, surrounded by bouquets of flowers. It was an opulent affair, befitting the man who had amassed a fortune through means most considered unsavory. Above the coffin was the CCTV camera, perched ominously, its lens trained directly at Richard's face. A small, dusty television monitor stood nearby, ready to broadcast the live footage to the chosen few. Lena stood among the crowd, watching as the service began. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. No one seemed to know exactly what to expect, and the eerie presence of the camera only heightened the unease. The priest delivered the eulogy, speaking in vague terms about Richard's achievements and his contributions to the town. His words seemed hollow, devoid of the warmth usually present at such ceremonies. It was clear that, while Richard's wealth had bought him power and respect, it had failed to earn him genuine affection. After the eulogy, the guests were ushered to a side room where the live feed of the CCTV camera was being broadcast. Only a handful of people had been invited to watch, including Lena. She took her seat at the back of the room, her eyes fixed on the screen. The footage began. At first, it was simple, a view of Richard's face in the coffin, still and lifeless. But then something strange happened. The camera, which had been perfectly still, suddenly shifted. A slight movement. Lena's heart skipped a beat. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a technical malfunction. But then the camera shook again, more noticeably this time. Richard's face seemed to twitch. "Impossible," Lena muttered under her breath. The guests in the room stirred, murmurs of confusion rippling through the crowd. The footage continued, the camera now panning as though it were following something. Then, it happened. The coffin lid, which had been firmly shut, began to creak. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the wood. Richard's body twitched again, his hands slightly moving. It was as if he was alive, or as though he had just awoken from a deep slumber. The room fell silent. "Someone must have tampered with the camera," one of the guests suggested, though their voice was shaky. But Lena wasn't convinced. She knew this wasn't a simple technical glitch or a trick. This was something far more dangerous, and far more calculated. The footage continued to capture Richard's body moving, but now something darker became clear. As the coffin lid opened further, Lena could see that Richard wasn't just twitching. His fingers were now moving, slowly, deliberately, as if he were trying to escape. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, a muffled thud from inside the coffin. The lid opened completely, revealing not the body of Richard Hawthorne, but a hollowed-out shell. Inside, wrapped in dark cloth, was a mannequin, a perfect replica of Richard's body. Lena's mind raced. A decoy. Richard hadn't died at all. At that moment, the room erupted into chaos. Guests screamed, running toward the exit, while others tried to understand what they were seeing. But Lena's focus remained on the screen, her thoughts aligning into a chilling realization. Richard Hawthorne had faked his death, using the CCTV footage as a means to gather the people he knew would come after him. The camera wasn't just a strange request, it was a trap. The footage was designed to lead them here, to a carefully orchestrated point in time, where the truth would be revealed. As Lena made her way toward the exit, a voice called out to her from the shadows. "You're too late," a figure whispered. It was one of the business associates, the ones who had profited from Richard's hidden dealings. "He's been watching all along." Lena turned, her heart pounding in her chest. Richard had set everything into motion long before his death, playing the ultimate game of cat and mouse with those who had once tried to destroy him. But now, the final game was about to begin. Lena froze, her eyes narrowing as the figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Victor Hanley, one of Richard Hawthorne's closest business partners, someone Lena had long suspected of being involved in the underhanded deals that Richard had run throughout his career. But this wasn't just about business anymore. Richard had set a trap, and Victor had willingly walked right into it. "Too late for what?" Lena asked, her voice steady, despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her. "What's really going on here?" Victor smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a grin laced with frustration and fear. "You're still trying to piece it together, aren't you, detective?" Richard was never just some businessman. He wasn't a man to be underestimated. Everything you're seeing, the coffin, the CCTV, was part of his plan to expose the people who thought they could control him. "People like me." He paused, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "You should know. He's not dead. He's somewhere watching this unfold right now. And he's been waiting for this moment." Lena felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She had assumed this was all some elaborate ruse to escape from enemies or a desperate attempt to escape some unknown danger. But what if Richard had been playing a much deeper game, one that involved far more than just himself? What if he had been setting up everyone around him for a downfall they couldn't see coming? Victor's words lingered in her mind. He's been waiting for this moment. Lena stepped back cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. The CCTV monitor was still broadcasting the unsettling footage of the empty coffin, the mannequin lying inside in place of Richard's body. It was only a matter of time before the real Richard reappeared, and when he did, everything would change. "You think you're safe?" Lena said, her voice sharp as she turned her focus back to Victor. "You're not. You're just another piece in his game. And he's going to expose everything." Victor's face twitched, his eyes darting toward the door as if he were considering making a run for it. But he stopped, clearly realizing there was no escape. "You don't get it, Lena," he said, his voice low. "Richard's been watching all of us for years. Everything we did. Every deal. Every betrayal. You think the CCTV camera was just for show? It was only part of the plan." Lena felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had assumed the camera had been placed to capture evidence of whoever had been involved in Richard's death. But now she realized it had been there to capture something far more critical, the people who thought they had a hold over him, the ones who believed Richard had outlived his usefulness and needed to be erased. The true purpose of the footage wasn't to implicate the ones who had a hand in his death. It was to make them reveal themselves. Richard had orchestrated everything from his fake death to the live stream. The people in the room, Victor included, were part of his final reckoning. The ground beneath Lena's feet felt unstable as she pieced together the web of deception that had enveloped the room. If Richard was still alive, somewhere, hiding and watching, that meant someone else was controlling the narrative. Someone had been working behind the scenes, helping him manipulate everyone in this room, using their greed and fear to drive them into making critical mistakes. And then, the camera blinked. It wasn't just a glitch or a malfunction this time. The feed flickered and suddenly, the screen shifted. The image of the empty coffin was gone. Now, the CCTV camera showed an abandoned office building, the lights dim and the air thick with dust. It was the old Hawthorne Enterprises building, the site of many of Richard's early deals, the very place where many of his enemies had once plotted to take him down. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Richard had left another clue. "Victor," she said, her voice steady, "I think you've been led here. Richard's been playing you all along. And now, he's giving us the key to find him." Victor looked confused for a moment, but the realization hit him like a slap. His eyes widened with shock. "No. He can't be, he wouldn't dare." Lena didn't wait to hear more. She was already moving toward the exit. If Richard had left them a trail to follow, she was going to find him, and maybe, just maybe, she could prevent the fallout that was about to shake Oakwood to its very core. Lena arrived at the dilapidated office building in the dead of night. The area around it was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. The building, once a shining beacon of Richard's success, had fallen into decay over the years. Its windows were boarded up, the once grand facade now covered in grime and shadows. But Lena had no doubt, this was the place. She walked inside cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the hollow emptiness. The building had been abandoned for over a decade, but Richard's connections to the property ran deep. If he was hiding here, this was likely where it all started. As Lena walked through the darkened halls, her flashlight beam revealed the remnants of a forgotten empire, old files, dusty furniture, and broken signs that once bore the name Hawthorne Enterprises. The deeper she went into the building, the more she felt the weight of the past bearing down on her. Finally, she arrived at the old office, Richard's private room. The door creaked open with a faint groan, revealing the space exactly as it had been when he left. A desk sat in the middle of the room, papers scattered across it. A large leather chair behind the desk had been pushed back, as though someone had just vacated it. Lena stepped in, her heart pounding. The camera feed from earlier had shown this office, and now she was here. She approached the desk, scanning the contents. There were old letters, files, and business documents, but nothing that immediately screamed clue until she noticed a small, faded photograph tucked into the corner of the desk drawer. Lena took it out, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a photo of Richard, standing next to a man she recognized, Victor Hanley. But what struck her was the date written on the back, 1999. Below that, a single line of text, "Trust no one." Lena's breath caught in her throat. This was the piece of the puzzle she had been missing. Richard had known from the beginning. He had trusted no one, not even those closest to him. As she stared at the photo, Lena heard a sound behind her, a soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard giving way. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The game had just begun. The watcher in the coffin continued. Lena's heart raced as she turned, hearing the floorboard creak behind her. She whipped around, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun at her side, but the office was empty. The door had closed behind her, yet no one was there. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though someone, was watching her. The photograph in her hand seemed to pulse with an odd energy, the words on the back of the picture haunting her, "Trust no one." She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the darkness that had surrounded Richard Hawthorne for years. She stepped toward the desk, placing the photograph down carefully as she looked around the room again. Something was off. The building seemed too quiet, too still. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, flickering every so often. Suddenly, her flashlight beam caught something out of place, a small trapdoor at the far corner of the room. It was nearly hidden by an old filing cabinet, but the light revealed it. It was old, rusted, and barely noticeable unless you were looking closely. Without hesitation, Lena moved toward it, crouching down to get a better look. She pulled at the latch and with a strained creak, the door opened, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the dark below. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She knew, deep down, that this was where she would find the answers. The stairs creaked as Lena descended, each step sending a wave of dust and mildew into the air. The deeper she went, the colder it became. It was as if the temperature dropped several degrees as she moved further into the bowels of the building. Finally, the stairs ended in a dimly lit underground room, its walls lined with rows of old filing cabinets and rusted metal shelves filled with papers. The room had the musty smell of forgotten secrets, a place that hadn't been touched in years. But then something caught her eye, a large steel door at the far end, slightly ajar. She stepped toward it cautiously, every instinct telling her to be ready for anything. She pushed the door open, and inside, she found what she had been looking for. At first glance, the room looked like a high-tech surveillance center, monitors, wires, and complex equipment everywhere. But what sent a chill down her spine wasn't the technology. It was the man sitting at the center of it all. Richard Hawthorne. Or rather, the real Richard Hawthorne. He was no ghost. No decoy. He was alive. Richard sat in front of a large monitor, his eyes focused on the screen. He didn't even look up as Lena entered the room. His expression was calm, almost detached, as though he had been expecting her. "You found it," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "You're the only one who ever figured it out." Lena's mind raced. You faked your death. All of this was part of your plan?" Richard finally turned toward her, a slow, calculating smile curling at the edges of his lips. "Yes. I had to disappear, Lena. Too many enemies, too many people who thought they could control me. But I had one last move to play. And you, detective, were the one I needed." Lena's heart sank. "What are you talking about? Why me?" Richard leaned back in his chair, as if savoring the moment. "You've been chasing my ghosts for years. You were always so close, but you never quite reached the truth. You were the perfect person to pull this off. You were the one who could uncover everything. And now, here you are. The final piece." Lena's mind whirled. She had been investigating Richard's empire for years, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined this. He had been playing a game all along, using her as a pawn in his elaborate plan. But why? "Why reveal yourself now?" Lena asked, trying to steady her breath. "Why not just stay hidden?" Richard's gaze darkened. "Because, Lena, the real game is just beginning. I'm done running from the shadows. Now, I'm going to expose everything. All the people who thought they could control me. All the secrets I've kept. It's time for them to face the consequences." Lena's pulse quickened as she realized the scope of what Richard was planning. He wasn't just looking for revenge on his enemies. He was going to dismantle everything, the businesses, the powerful figures who had thought they could bury him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about domination. "You're insane," she said, stepping back, her mind racing. "You can't just destroy everything." Richard stood up, his eyes flashing with intensity. "You don't understand, do you? For years, I've been the puppet, and now I'm cutting the strings. But I need your help, Lena. You're the only one who can help me bring it all down." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, help you?" Richard stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You've been investigating me for so long. You know the people who've been part of my empire. You've seen the corruption, the deals, the lies. I need you to help me expose them. Together, we can take them all down." Lena stood frozen. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Richard had already manipulated her into this situation. He had been playing her from the very beginning, using her as both the investigator and the key player in his final act of revenge. She didn't know if she could trust him, but one thing was certain, she couldn't walk away. "I'll help you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Richard smiled, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I knew you would." Over the next few weeks, Lena found herself drawn deeper into Richard's web. Together, they uncovered the truth about the vast network of corruption that had been pulling the strings behind Oakwood's most influential figures. Each piece of the puzzle was more disturbing than the last, and soon, Lena realized just how far Richard's reach had gone. But as they neared the end of their investigation, something strange began to happen. Lena started to see cracks in Richard's plan, small details that didn't add up. He had been so meticulous, so careful, but there was one thing he hadn't accounted for, her. Lena wasn't just a pawn anymore. She was a player. One night, while Richard was preoccupied with his final moves, Lena quietly accessed the surveillance system he had set up, reviewing footage of the CCTV cameras he had installed across the town. What she found was shocking. Richard had been orchestrating his own demise from the very beginning, using his death as a way to escape from the final stage of his own plan. The truth was, Richard Hawthorne had never intended to live. He had wanted to disappear completely, leaving behind a legacy of chaos and ruin. But in his final moments, Lena realized something she hadn't before: Richard was just another ghost. And ghosts, she thought, could only haunt the living for so long.